The piercing scream that tore through Hannah Taylor's body was swallowed by the empty buildings of Clearwater, a once thriving mining town now abandoned to the whims of the harsh Arizona desert. The year was 1878, and Hannah was completely alone as another contraction seized her body, forcing her to grip the rotting floorboards of what had once been the town's hotel. "Please," she whispered to no one, her voice breaking as sweat poured down her face. "Please help me." But there was no one to hear her pleas in this ghost town where she'd sought refuge 3 days earlier, her swollen belly and dwindling supplies forcing her to stop her journey west. Her husband Thomas had died 2 months prior from typhoid, leaving her alone and pregnant on the trail to California, where they'd planned to start anew. Hannah's water had broken at dawn, and now as the merciless afternoon sun beat down on the weathered roof, she knew the baby was coming whether she was ready or not. She had arranged what few clean cloths she had beside her makeshift bed on the floor, placed her canteen of water within reach, and now she prayed for strength as another wave of pain crashed through her. "You can do this," she told herself through gritted teeth. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. But as the hours wore on and the pain intensified, Hannah's confidence wavered. The baby seemed stuck, and her strength was fading fast. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the broken windows, Hannah feared she might not live to see her child. "Thomas," she cried out to her dead husband as she pushed with what little energy remained, "I cannot do this alone." And then, suddenly, with one final, desperate push, she felt the baby slide from her body. For one terrifying moment, there was silence. Hannah held her breath, too exhausted to move, then a small, indignant cry pierced the stillness. "Oh, thank God," Hannah sobbed, summoning her remaining strength to reach down and bring the squirming, bloody infant to her chest. "Hello, my darling, hello." It was a girl, small but perfect, with a shock of dark hair like her father's. Hannah cleaned the baby as best she could with trembling hands, cut the cord with her small knife, and wrapped her daughter in the cleanest cloth she had. As night fell, Hannah's exhaustion overtook her. She had managed to feed the baby, who now slept peacefully against her breast, but Hannah herself was weak from blood loss and the ordeal of childbirth. She knew she needed help, but there was no one for miles. "We'll rest tonight," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." But Hannah knew there might not be a tomorrow for her. The bleeding hadn't stopped, and a fever was starting to take hold. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she prayed that somehow someone would find her baby girl before it was too late. Miles away, Jacob Walker urged his horse forward through the growing darkness. He hadn't meant to be riding so late, but his business in Tucson had taken longer than expected, and he was eager to reach his ranch 30 miles north. A shortcut through the abandoned mining town of Clearwater would save him precious hours. Jacob was 30 years old, sun-weathered and strong from years of ranch work. He had come west as a young man with dreams of building something of his own, and after 10 years of back-breaking labor, he had a modest but successful cattle ranch. What he didn't have was a family. The isolation of ranch life and the constant work had left little time for courting, though the loneliness of his existence weighed on him more with each passing year. As the ghostly silhouettes of Clearwater's abandoned buildings appeared in the moonlight, Jacob felt the familiar prickle of unease that accompanied passing through these forgotten places. Ghost towns were eerie reminders of how quickly fortune could turn in the West. He was nearly through the town when his horse suddenly stopped, ears pricking forward. "What is it, Scout?" Jacob murmured, patting the animal's neck. Then he heard a thin, reedy cry that couldn't possibly be the wind. Jacob dismounted, tying Scout to a hitching post that still stood outside what had once been the town's hotel. The crying grew louder as he approached the building, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Cautiously, he pushed open the door, which creaked loudly on rusty hinges. The crying paused momentarily before resuming with renewed vigor. "Hello," Jacob called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Anybody here?" There was no response except for the continued wailing. Jacob moved further into the building, following the sound up a rickety staircase to the second floor. The crying led him to a room at the end of the hallway, its door partially open. Jacob pushed it wider, and the sight that greeted him made his heart stop. A young woman lay on the floor, deathly pale in the moonlight that streamed through the broken window. Beside her, wrapped in bloody cloths, was a newborn baby, red-faced and crying desperately. "Dear God," Jacob whispered, holstering his gun and rushing to kneel beside them. The woman's eyes fluttered open at his approach, unfocused and glazed with fever. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My baby." "I'm here to help," Jacob assured her, quickly assessing the situation. The woman had clearly given birth alone, and from the looks of it, not long ago. She was losing blood and fever had set in. Without medical attention, her chances were slim. "What's your name, madam?" he asked gently, taking off his bandana and dipping it in her canteen to cool her forehead. "Hannah," she replied weakly. "Hannah Taylor. I'm Jacob Walker." "I'm going to help you and your baby, Hannah." He spoke with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Can you tell me how long ago the baby came? Hours, maybe, I don't know." Hannah's eyes drifted to her child. "Her name is Elizabeth, after my mother," Jacob nodded, already formulating a plan. The nearest doctor was in Fort Whipple, at least a day's ride away. Hannah needed help now. "I'm going to get you both out of here," he said firmly. "My ranch is closer than town. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, has delivered plenty of babies in her time." Hannah's eyes closed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't think I can ride." "You won't have to," Jacob assured her. He gently picked up the baby, who had quieted somewhat at the sound of adult voices. "I'll be right back." Jacob hurried downstairs with Elizabeth carefully cradled against his chest. The tiny girl's face was scrunched up, her little fists balled against his shirt. He had never held a newborn before, and the feeling of such a small, vulnerable life in his hands was overwhelming. Outside, he quickly fashioned a sling for the baby from his spare shirt, securing her against his body. Then he returned to Hannah with his bedroll and canteen. Hannah was semi-conscious when he returned, her breathing shallow. "Hannah, stay with me," Jacob urged, helping her drink a little water. "I'm going to wrap you up and carry you down to my horse." She nodded weakly, seemingly unable to speak. Jacob worked efficiently, wrapping her in his bedroll to keep her warm and to help contain the bleeding. Then, with the baby secured against his chest and Hannah in his arms, he carefully navigated back down the stairs. Getting Hannah onto his horse was a challenge, but Jacob managed it, positioning her in front of him so he could support her with one arm while holding the reins with the other. The baby remained snugly in the makeshift sling, mercifully quiet for the moment. "Hold on," he whispered to Hannah as he urged Scout into a gentle walk. "Just hold on." The journey to Jacob's ranch was slow and treacherous. He dared not push Scout to more than a gentle trot, fearing the motion would worsen Hannah's condition. Throughout the night, he spoke to her continuously, telling her about his ranch, about the beautiful view from his homestead, about the stream that ran crystal clear through his property. Anything to keep her conscious, to give her something to hold on to. Hannah drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally mumbling about her husband Thomas or asking about Elizabeth. Each time, Jacob reassured her that the baby was fine, nestled safely against his chest. Dawn was breaking when they finally crested the hill that overlooked Jacob's ranch. The modest homestead sat in a sheltered valley with a small main house, a bunkhouse for the few hands he employed, a barn and corrals for the horses and cattle. Jacob could see Mrs. Abernathy already up and about, hanging laundry on the line behind the house. He whistled loudly, and the older woman looked up, shading her eyes against the rising sun. "Mrs. Abernathy," he called out, "I need help." The housekeeper dropped her laundry basket and hurried toward him as he guided Scout down the hill. By the time he reached the yard, Mrs. Abernathy was already issuing orders to the ranch hands who had emerged from the bunkhouse. "Good heavens, Mr. Walker," she exclaimed, her eyes widening at the sight of Hannah and the baby. "What on earth found them in Clearwater?" Jacob explained quickly as two of his men helped ease Hannah down from the horse. "She gave birth alone. The baby seems all right, but she's in a bad way." Mrs. Abernathy took charge immediately, directing the men to carry Hannah into the house and to the spare bedroom. Jacob carefully removed Elizabeth from the sling, marveling again at how tiny she was. "Give her here," Mrs. Abernathy said, taking the baby with practiced ease. You did right bringing them here, Mr. Walker. Now let me see what can be done. For the next several hours, Jacob paced outside the spare bedroom while Mrs. Abernathy worked inside with her collection of herbal remedies and the practical knowledge gained from a lifetime on the frontier. Elizabeth had been cleaned, fed some goat's milk, and now slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer. When Mrs. Abernathy finally emerged, her apron bloodied but her face cautiously optimistic, Jacob felt a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. She's young and strong, the housekeeper reported. The bleeding stopped and I've managed to bring the fever down some. If we can keep infection at bay, she has a good chance. Jacob thanked her fervently and Mrs. Abernathy waved off his gratitude. That baby is a miracle, she said. Born in a ghost town with no help, and here she is, healthy as can be. Her mama must have done something right. Jacob was allowed to look in on Hannah briefly. She was sleeping, her face still pale but more peaceful now. Mrs. Abernathy had dressed her in one of Jacob's shirts, the only thing large enough to fit comfortably over her still swollen abdomen. She'll need rest, good food, and time, Mrs. Abernathy advised. And that baby will need proper clothes and supplies. I'll make a list for you to take to town. Jacob nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the responsibility he had taken on. He had only meant to help someone in distress, but now a young mother and her newborn were depending on him. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Abernathy placed a gnarled hand on his arm. You did a good thing, Mr. Walker. The good Lord put you on that path for a reason. The next several days established a new routine at the Walker Ranch. Jacob rode to town and returned with baby supplies, women's clothing for Hannah, and additional food. Mrs. Abernathy took primary care of both mother and child, but Jacob found himself increasingly drawn to the spare bedroom where they rested. Hannah's recovery was slow but steady. The fever broke completely on the third day, and by the end of the week, she was able to sit up and feed Elizabeth herself. Jacob made a point to visit daily, bringing flowers from the meadow or simply sitting beside her bed, telling her stories of ranch life to pass the time. He learned that Hannah was 22, born in St. Louis to a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Hannah was 15. She had married Thomas Taylor, a carpenter, at 19, and they had dreamed of starting a new life in California. Thomas caught typhoid 2 months ago, Hannah explained one evening, her voice steady but her eyes downcast. He was gone within a week. I didn't know what else to do but continue west. I had nothing to go back to. Jacob nodded, understanding the pull of the frontier, the desperate hope for a new beginning that drove so many westward. What will you do now? He asked carefully. Hannah looked down at Elizabeth, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. I don't know, she admitted. I have a little money saved, but not enough to start over on my own with a baby. You're welcome to stay here until you're fully recovered, Jacob offered, and after that. Well, we can figure something out. Hannah's grateful smile warmed something in Jacob's chest that he hadn't realized was cold. As the days turned into weeks, Hannah grew stronger. She began to help Mrs. Abernathy with simple household tasks, Elizabeth wrapped securely against her in a sling. Jacob often found himself watching them from a distance, struck by how naturally they seemed to fit into the rhythm of his home. One evening, about a month after he had found them, Jacob returned from checking the herd to find Hannah sitting on the porch, Elizabeth sleeping in a basket beside her. The setting sun cast a golden glow over them both, and Jacob was struck by how beautiful Hannah looked, her color restored and her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Mind if I join you? He asked, removing his hat. Hannah smiled and patted the space beside her. Please do. It's a beautiful evening. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower behind the distant mountains. I've been thinking, Hannah said finally, about what comes next. Jacob felt a strange tightness in his chest. Oh, Mrs. Abernathy says there's a need for a schoolteacher in town. With my father's training, I could do that. Maybe find a small place to rent. You're considering staying in the area. Jacob tried to keep his voice neutral, though the prospect pleased him more than he cared to admit. Hannah nodded. Elizabeth and I have imposed on your hospitality long enough. It's time we made our own way. You haven't imposed, Jacob said quickly. Having you both here has been, he paused, searching for the right word. Nice. Hannah turned to look at him, her eyes thoughtful. You're a good man, Jacob Walker. Not many would have done what you did for us. Anyone would have, he demurred. No, Hannah said firmly, not anyone. You saved our lives. Jacob felt his face warm under her direct gaze. I'm glad I was there. Before Hannah could respond, Elizabeth stirred and began to fuss. Hannah picked her up, cradling her close. I think someone's hungry, she said with a smile. I should take her in. Jacob nodded, standing to help Hannah up. Their hands touched briefly, and Jacob felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation. As Hannah went inside, Jacob remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The idea of Hannah and Elizabeth leaving his ranch left a hollow feeling in his chest. In just a month, they had transformed his solitary existence into something warmer, more meaningful. He knew then that he didn't want them to go. But he also knew that Hannah deserved the chance to build her own life, to make her own choices after everything she had endured. The following week, Jacob drove Hannah and Elizabeth into town to inquire about the teaching position. The town of Pinecrest was small but growing, with a one-room schoolhouse that had been without a teacher since the spring. The town council, meeting hastily at the general store, was impressed by Hannah's education and her composed manner. They offered her the position starting with the fall term, along with a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. It needs some work, the mayor admitted, but it would be yours as part of your compensation. Hannah accepted gratefully, and Jacob congratulated her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. On the drive back to the ranch, Hannah was animated, discussing her plans for the school and the cottage. Jacob listened, trying to share in her excitement while ignoring the growing sense of loss. Of course, we won't move in until closer to the start of term, Hannah said. That will give me time to prepare lessons and for someone to make the cottage habitable. Jacob nodded, focusing on the road ahead. I can help with the repairs, he offered. Maybe some of my hands too. Oh, Jacob, would you? That would be wonderful. Hannah's smile was radiant, and despite his melancholy, Jacob couldn't help smiling back. Over the next few weeks, Jacob spent his spare time working on the cottage in town. He replaced rotted floorboards, fixed the leaky roof, built new shelves, and even constructed a proper cradle for Elizabeth. Hannah often accompanied him, helping where she could and preparing the small garden behind the house for planting. During these days, working side by side, something shifted between them. Their conversations flowed more easily, with comfortable silences interspersed. Jacob found himself sharing memories and hopes he had never voiced aloud before, and Hannah spoke freely of her life before, of Thomas, and of her fears and dreams for Elizabeth's future. One afternoon, as they were painting the cottage's main room, Jacob glanced over to see Hannah with a streak of white paint across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out to wipe it away. His hand lingered on her face, and Hannah went very still, her eyes meeting his. Hannah, he said softly, his heart pounding. Before he could continue, Elizabeth began to cry from her basket in the corner, breaking the moment. Hannah stepped away quickly, moving to comfort her daughter. Jacob returned to his painting, mentally berating himself. Hannah was still in mourning for her husband, still finding her footing in a new place. The last thing she needed was his confused feelings complicating matters. But as the days passed, Jacob found it increasingly difficult to ignore the attachment he felt to both Hannah and Elizabeth. The baby had begun to recognize him, cooing and reaching for him whenever he entered a room. And Hannah. The way she looked at him sometimes made him wonder if perhaps she might one day see him as more than just the man who had rescued her. The night before Hannah and Elizabeth were set to move into the cottage, now fully repaired and furnished, Mrs. Abernathy prepared a special dinner. The table was laid with her best linens, wildflowers arranged in a jar at the center, and the meal was more elaborate than their usual fare. A little celebration, the housekeeper explained when Hannah expressed surprise. For your new beginning. Dinner was a pleasant affair, though tinged with the melancholy of impending departure. Elizabeth was passed around, cooed over, and thoroughly spoiled with attention. Even the ranch hands, who had grown fond of the baby's morning appearances on the porch, came by to wish Hannah well and to present her with a hand-carved wooden horse for Elizabeth. After the meal, when Mrs. Abernathy had retired and Elizabeth was asleep, Hannah and Jacob found themselves alone on the porch once more, just as they had been that evening a month earlier. "I can't thank you enough," Hannah said, her voice soft in the twilight, "for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Jacob replied. "Having you and Elizabeth here, it's been good for this place, for me." Hannah turned to face him fully. "What do you mean?" Jacob looked out at his land, searching for the right words. "I've been alone a long time," he finally said. "Built all this, worked hard, but never really thought about why, what it was all for." He gestured vaguely at the ranch spreading out before them. "These past weeks, having you both here, it gave it purpose." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. "We'll only be in town," she said gently. "Not so far away." "I know," Jacob nodded, "and I'm happy for you truly. You'll make a fine teacher." Hannah reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that Elizabeth and I will always be grateful to you, not just for saving us, but for showing us kindness when we needed it most." Jacob turned his hand to clasp hers. "Hannah, he took a deep breath. "I care for you, for both of you, more than I probably should." Hannah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Jacob, I know," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know before you left." Hannah's expression softened. "Thomas was my first love," she said carefully. "He'll always have a place in my heart, but he would want Elizabeth and me to be happy, to have a good life." She squeezed Jacob's hand. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that you have become important to us, very important." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of possibility. For Jacob, it was enough. The next morning, Jacob drove Hannah and Elizabeth to their new home in town. The cottage looked welcoming with its fresh paint and new curtains, the garden beginning to show signs of life. Inside, everything was arranged just as Hannah had planned. With special touches, Jacob had added a rocking chair by the fireplace, bookshelves filled with volumes ordered from back east, a small desk where Hannah could prepare her lessons. As Jacob carried in the last of their belongings, Hannah stood in the center of the main room, taking it all in. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Better than I could have hoped for." Jacob set down the trunk he was carrying and straightened, looking around at what they had created together. "It suits you," he said simply. Hannah stepped closer to him, Elizabeth balanced on her hip. "Will you come visit us, as often as you'll allow?" Jacob promised. Hannah smiled, and in a gesture that surprised them both, she rose on tiptoe to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "We'll be counting on it," she said. As Jacob rode back to his ranch that evening, the emptiness of the house hit him harder than he had expected. Mrs. Abernathy had prepared his favorite meal, but he found he had little appetite. After dinner, he sat alone on the porch, the absence of Hannah and Elizabeth's presence a tangible thing. But there was also hope, a small flame kindled by Hannah's words and that gentle kiss. It wasn't an ending, he told himself. It was just a new chapter beginning. Over the following months, Jacob made good on his promise to visit regularly. He brought small gifts, fresh eggs from his hens, a new book he thought Hannah might enjoy, a toy he had carved for Elizabeth. He helped maintain the cottage, fixing whatever needed repair and adding improvements when he saw the need. Hannah began teaching in September, earning the respect of both her students and their parents with her gentle but firm approach and her obvious love of learning. Elizabeth thrived in the cottage, growing stronger and more active by the day. Jacob often joined them for Sunday dinner after church, a tradition that soon expanded to include occasional midweek visits. As autumn deepened into winter, these visits became the highlight of his week. One snowy evening in December, Jacob arrived at the cottage to find Hannah looking particularly lovely in a blue dress he hadn't seen before. Elizabeth, now nearly 6 months old, greeted him with excited babbling from her blanket on the floor. "Something smells wonderful," Jacob said as he removed his snow-dusted hat and coat. "Venison stew," Hannah replied. "Mr. Henderson brought some by as a thank you for helping his son with his reading." The cottage was warm and inviting, with a fire crackling in the hearth and candles lit on the table. After dinner, they sat before the fire, Elizabeth playing with a soft cloth doll on the rug between them. "Jacob," Hannah said after a companionable silence. "There's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Jacob felt a flutter of apprehension. "What is it?" Hannah's eyes were serious as she looked at him. "We've known each other for half a year now." Jacob nodded, waiting for her to continue. "In that time, you've become very important to Elizabeth and me." Hannah took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the night before we moved here, about caring for us." Jacob's heart began to race. "I meant it," he said quietly. "I still do." Hannah smiled, a mixture of nervousness and determination on her face. "I've come to care for you too, Jacob, very much." The words hung in the air between them, full of promise. "Hannah," Jacob began, then stopped, overwhelmed by emotion. "I never expected to find someone like you. Someone who makes me think about more than just the next day's work or the next season's calving." He leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Hannah Taylor. You and Elizabeth both. I know it might still be too soon." Hannah stopped him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Thomas will always be a part of me, of Elizabeth, but my heart has room for new love, Jacob, for you." Jacob felt a surge of joy so powerful it nearly took his breath away. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning, but when Hannah responded, wrapping her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Elizabeth let out a delighted squeal from her spot on the floor, as if approving of this new development. Jacob laughed, reaching down to scoop the baby into his arms. "What do you think, Miss Elizabeth?" "Would you mind terribly if I asked your mama to marry me?" Hannah gasped, her eyes wide. "Jacob," he turned to her, suddenly serious despite Elizabeth's attempts to grab his nose. "I know it seems fast, Hannah, but I love you. I want to build a life with you both. I want to be a father to Elizabeth to watch her grow up. I want more children with you if you're willing." Tears filled Hannah's eyes, but she was smiling. "Are you certain marriage is a big step?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Jacob assured her, "but only if you feel the same." Hannah reached out to stroke Elizabeth's cheek, then looked up at Jacob with shining eyes. "We would be honored to become your family, Jacob Walker." They were married on a clear, cold day in January 1879 in the small church in Pinecrest. Mrs. Abernathy held Elizabeth during the ceremony, the baby dressed in a christening gown that had been Hannah's own. The entire town turned out for the celebration, as well as Jacob's ranch hands and neighbors from miles around. Hannah continued teaching until the end of the school term in May, by which time she, Jacob, and Elizabeth had settled into a routine that bridged their two homes. Some nights were spent at the cottage in town, others at the ranch. As summer approached, they made the decision to move permanently to the ranch, with Hannah making the trip into town for school when the new term began. Their first year of marriage brought challenges, as all marriages do. Hannah had been used to town life and the relative ease of the cottage, while ranch life was harder, more isolated. Jacob, accustomed to making decisions alone, had to learn to consider his wife's opinions and needs. But underlying these adjustments was a deep and growing love, a partnership that strengthened with each passing day. Elizabeth thrived under their combined care, taking her first steps in the ranch house's main room and speaking her first clear words, "Mama" and "Papa," within days of each other. Jacob legally adopted her on her first birthday, though in his heart, she had been his daughter from the moment he first held her in that abandoned hotel. In the spring of 1880, Hannah discovered she was expecting another child. The news filled them both with joy and some trepidation, given Hannah's difficult experience with Elizabeth's birth. But with proper medical care available this time, their son James was born safely in November, with Jacob holding Hannah's hand throughout the delivery. As the years passed, the Walker family grew and prospered. A third child, a daughter they named Sarah, arrived in 1883. The ranch expanded as Jacob's hard work and business acumen paid off. Hannah occasionally substituted at the school in town, but primarily devoted herself to raising their children and creating a warm, loving home. On Elizabeth's 5th birthday, Hannah and Jacob took her to Clearwater, now nothing more than a few crumbling buildings. They explained how she had been born there, how Jacob had found them, and how their family had begun in the most unlikely of places. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," Jacob told his daughter as they stood looking at the dilapidated hotel where she had entered the world. "Finding you and your mama changed my life." Hannah slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "God's plan works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "I was so afraid that night, so certain we wouldn't survive, but he sent you to us, Jacob." Jacob squeezed her hand, looking at his beautiful wife and their growing family with a heart full of gratitude. From the darkest moment of Hannah's life had come their greatest joy, a family built on love, respect, and the kind of deep bond that only shared struggle and triumph could forge. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch home watching their children play in the yard, Jacob pulled Hannah close against his side. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to take that shortcut through Clearwater that night?" he asked. Hannah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "Sometimes, but then I remember what my father used to say, that certain souls are meant to find each other, no matter what." Jacob smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I believe that," he said. "I believe we would have found each other somehow, some way." Hannah rested her head on his shoulder, content in the knowledge that what had begun as a desperate cry in a ghost town had led to a love that would sustain them for all their days. In the spring of 1895, 17 years after that fateful night, Elizabeth Walker stood in her bedroom at the ranch, adjusting the veil on her wedding dress. At 22, she was the image of her mother, dark-haired, graceful, with the same determined spirit that had kept Hannah alive in that abandoned hotel. A knock at the door preceded Hannah's entrance, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of her daughter as a bride. "Oh, Elizabeth," she breathed, "you look beautiful." Elizabeth smiled, the same smile that had first captured Jacob's heart when she was just days old. "Do you think Papa will cry?" "Without a doubt," Hannah laughed, moving to adjust a strand of her daughter's hair. "He's been practicing his speech for weeks, but I'm not sure he'll get through it without breaking down." Elizabeth took her mother's hands in hers. "Tell me again," she said softly, "about the night I was born." It was a story Elizabeth had heard countless times, but today, on the threshold of beginning her own family, it held special significance. Hannah sat beside her daughter on the bed, smoothing the white satin of the wedding dress. "I was so scared," she began, as she always did. "Alone in that ghost town, with you determined to make your appearance whether I was ready or not." Elizabeth listened, enraptured as always by the tale of her dramatic entry into the world and Jacob's timely arrival. "I was certain I was dying," Hannah continued. "But then your father appeared, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known to make. And he saved us," Elizabeth finished, familiar with this part of the story. Hannah smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "He did. But it was more than that, Elizabeth. He gave us a home, a family, a future. He taught me that love can come again, even after great loss." She squeezed her daughter's hands. "That's what I wish for you and Robert, a love that sustains you through whatever life brings, that grows stronger with each challenge overcome." Elizabeth hugged her mother tightly. "I've had the best example," she whispered. Another knock at the door announced Jacob's arrival. At 52, his hair was threaded with silver, but he stood as tall and strong as the day he had carried Hannah and Elizabeth from Clearwater. "Are my girls ready?" he asked, his voice catching at the sight of his daughter in her wedding finery. "Just about, Papa," Elizabeth said, rising to kiss his cheek. Jacob took her hands, holding her at arm's length to look at her properly. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So proud of the woman you've become." Elizabeth felt tears threatening to spill. "I had good teachers," she said. Jacob glanced at Hannah, who was watching them with a loving smile. "The best," he agreed. "Your mother is the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known." Hannah rose to join them, completing the circle. "And your father is the most honorable, kind-hearted man to ever walk this earth." For a moment, the three of them stood together, a family created by chance, necessity, and love. Then from downstairs came the sound of guests arriving, of James and Sarah greeting them, of the future calling. "Time to go," Hannah said gently. As Elizabeth took her father's arm to descend the stairs, she paused, looking back at her mother. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Hannah watched as Jacob escorted their daughter downstairs to her waiting groom, her heart full of the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate birth in a ghost town to this day of celebration and new beginnings, it was more than she could have imagined on that lonely night 17 years ago. Outside, the spring sun shone brightly on the ranch that had become their kingdom, their sanctuary, their home. Jacob would walk Elizabeth down the aisle formed between chairs on the lawn, beneath the old oak tree where he and Hannah had often sat watching their children play. Hannah followed them down, pausing at the bottom of the stairs where Jacob waited for her, his hand extended just as it had been that first night when he helped her onto his horse. "Ready, Mrs. Walker?" he asked, his eyes still holding the same tenderness they had when he first looked at her. Hannah placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and love that had sustained her for 17 years and would continue to do so for all the years to come. "Ready, Mr. Walker," she replied, "always." Together, they stepped out into the sunlight, into the future that had begun with a baby's cry in a ghost town and a passing cowboy who had heard it.